I got it.
I see it.
Yeah, but that we were told this pretty good energy project was too long. If anybody has a better name than Ovanova Abundant Energy Show, nobody can say Ovanova anyway. But I think it's on.
I see it.
Welcome back, everybody. Yeah, but we were told this pretty good energy project was too long. If anybody has a better name, then that's what happens whenever you don't turn your YouTube off after you start streaming. So, Justin, welcome back. We didn't get a chance to finish our conversation last week. We had some good feedback on it. There were some people who said they really enjoyed the stuff that you shared, the in-depth nature that you went through and explaining oil. And first thing I wanted to ask you is just, I don't know, it's ironic, fitting, angel sign, or just a coincidence that since one of the last things we talked about was one of the reasons that we're compensated highly is because we work with things that can blow up. And then in between that conversation last week and this week, there was something down in that part of Texas where they do a lot of this type of work that did blow up. Do you know, or does everybody make it out okay? Or that's the first thing, you know about the families at all? Or know what's going on there?
Like you're talking about the one that made like the news, like 4 people injured, gasoline unit thing. Yeah, I mean,
what was that about? Like, how did that happen? Like, do you know, or like what could happen? Like, I guess it's like, you know, we just assume that it's safe, but your life is at risk. Like, you work in a plant not dissimilar from that one, correct? Like where there's the same danger. So I guess what's it like for you would be the question I'd be most interested in. And then technically, what are some things that could go wrong to lead to that outcome? So what's it like for you when you hear about a disaster? I can give you an example of like real quick that you might like. There was a kid that went out when he was selling books, and there was a lady who had a son enlisted. This is back during one of the conflicts in the early 2000s. And my friend said, "Oh, I had a friend who was in the military, and you know he didn't make it." And the lady whose son is in active duty said, "Well, your brother must have, or your friend must have done something wrong. He must not have followed orders." You know, because it's important for her to believe that as long as her son follows orders on active duty, he's safe, right? And so that, I don't know if that story makes sense for what I'm asking about now, but I'm wondering if you have to like protect your mind by saying if we follow protocols, it'll be okay, and like just what it's like for you to work in a place that can blow up.
Yeah, I mean, I guess what it's like means that you have to have a certain intensity. And so like one of the things that is talked about a lot in the industry is there is something called conventional wisdom. It's like, you know, like people refer to it as like common sense, use your brain, all that stuff. Like dads grumble at their sons about it. I think when you're in an industry like oil and gas, conventional wisdom is not enough, and you really do need to keep yourself safe. You need to learn very trade specific things. And so I know John and Victor, I visited the dome around, was it Thanksgiving? I want to say it was Thanksgiving. No, it wasn't Thanksgiving. It was late. Oh, it was September. I came over in September, and John is like doing electrical stuff, which is always really impressive to me. And so he's putting in a panel to get all of his electricity on the solar and batteries that he installed. Super impressive. It was like magic to me. And like John and Victor are working pretty quickly and efficiently, like with open wires, testing things. And if you don't know about electricity and you start touching live wires, you're not going to do well. You can be killed in this kind of the same manner. And so, I mean, I think it's kind of the same. It's like there's a lot of rules that you have to follow to keep yourself safe, like playing with electricity or literally playing with fire. And then the challenge about, we kind of talked about last time about what does the process look like from extracting oil from the ground all the way to processing it in a refinery or petrochemical plant. I mean, the whole way through, that stuff can explode or catch on fire. And so generally there's a lot of attention to, kind of like you're saying, there's a bunch of rules, but you still have random happenstance. Like you're still working with people, you're still working with machines that have some failures, still working with things that corrode. And so that was a really long answer to say there's a lot of intensity and attention spent trying to keep workers safe so that that stuff doesn't happen.
So like the mom with the kid, that if as long as he does everything right, he's going to be okay. But you know that he's in active duty, and you know that you work in a place that could explode at any moment. And that's just a risk you're willing to take so that we can drive to T-ball practice.
I mean, I guess so. I mean, I guess like in the same way that an electrician or a lineman, like, you know, when it's like a hurricane or a winter storm and everybody is screaming that they need their power back on. Those guys are like driving on slick roads, sometimes in areas that don't have potable water to restore service. Like I kind of view it as the same, if that makes any sense.
They could run off the road. They could get sick from drinking bad water, or you could get blown up. So which says there's an actual risk to life to restore power to people.
Yeah, that is what I'm saying. And I think what's one thing that is great about living, we happen to live in a first world country. A lot of people don't have to think about these things. Like we don't have to think about generally that the gasoline you put in your car can catch fire and harm people in the quantities that it's produced at. In the same way that you don't have to think about when you flip a switch, like that same electricity, if it's not installed properly or doesn't have the right breakers, could catch your house on fire or electrocute you to death, if that makes sense.
John would have to answer the question about whether or not that makes sense, but the metaphor makes sense. What are some things you think about now that you didn't think about before you contributed so many of your neurons to helping the oil continue to flow? Like what kind of stuff like are you just way more aware of now than a normal person would be expected or responsible to be, to have a little bit more respect for what's happening currently?
Yeah, I mean, like things like most people don't like chemistry. I am a chemistry nerd, but like I know, and most of my coworkers know generally when things, like what are the temperatures where things will catch fire? When will that happen spontaneously? What is the likelihood if you open a piece of pipe or a vessel that had hydrocarbon in it, whether it can catch fire? So I know like stuff about, we were trying to talk about safety. I know stuff about safety. I know stuff about, I know things about like, what is the rate or what do we expect the run life to be for equipment? I know a lot about the market that most people don't know about. We
Like
talked kind of.
what's something that a normal person might find interesting?
I mean, it might take a bit to get into, but like one thing that happens, yeah, that's true. One thing that happens pretty frequently is like there will be a regime change in the United States. So like typically that is a presidential regime change, and people go, "Oh man, the cost of oil. I can't believe this guy." And yeah, because it hasn't been a gal yet. I can't believe this guy and their policies causing the price at the pump to increase. We kind of talked about it a little bit last time, but oil is it's a global market. So I mean, like there can be policy impact, but normally like the executive impact is going to be a lot lower than policy impact. And it really is, it's subject to supply and demand. And so,
Yeah. So you're saying that it's such an important good that it really kind of abides pure economic principles, and that like get mad at Joe Biden or Donald Trump for the price of the gas going up is just kind of silly and uninformed. Understandable, because you want to blame somebody for it from a psychological standpoint, but from a factuality standpoint, it's not really the president.
exactly right.
Huh. Yeah. And so, but before you got into it, you kind of thought maybe it was the president's fault that the price of gas was what it was.
For sure. Before I started, like Hurricane Katrina happened, and I was like, man, I think it was George W. I was like, George W. Bush, $4 a gallon gasoline. Not his fault. Had way more to do with supply and demand.
How much? I looked up that question the other day and found out that I just looked up one oil company. It's a big one that everybody's used before, which you're really familiar with, Justin. And just that one oil company's public lease lands were about the size, not including the private holdings, not including international holdings, like in the United States, just public lands that they are leasing are about the same amount as that we would need to have solar power the entire United States, including our electric cars and the stuff that are coming. So,
because that was like the size of Lake Michigan, right?
yeah, it's a little bit less. It's like 21 versus 33,000 square miles, like 2/3. But I figured the real question was like, is the total amount of land? And you said almost positive they are. And I was just giving you one slice of one company. So when you put every company, and you realize like private holdings are probably larger than just public land. But what is that public land lease about? Do you know how that works? And I'm sure it's probably good. It provides something for the people of the United States. Like if you lease the land, do you take care of it and maintain it to keep it from wildfiring, or like obviously I guess you get to suck some oil out if you find some there. Like what's that like, that agreement? I didn't know anything about it until I found that thing.
You're talking about like when the US government allows oil companies a lease, like
Yeah.
they basically out the, yeah, I mean, like kind of back to, don't, I need to make sure to fact check myself, but like my understanding is while there's news about the cost of leases going up, in general, the Biden administration has given out more leases than the Trump administration for the same time in tenure. And I think just because so much oil and gas has been found stateside, that's probably been true since the Obama age. And I think the leases are for the kind of step one in the process that we talked about last week. It's the get the smart geologists in the room, understand whether there's a history of hydrocarbon stored there, and then if it makes sense, develop with the bendy straws and the siphons and the pumps a facility to go extract the oil. And so it's essentially the US government recognized, and I think there's some amount of fact that is apolitical in terms of based on all available technology, here's the energy requirement for the United States. And then there's obviously political parts, and like depending on which congressperson you talk to, I mean, it's both the most American thing you could ever do or the most un-American thing you could ever do. But like essentially it's the US government recognizing that they have land that is largely unused and taking a view that with the right regulations, that land can be safely developed to give America what it needs in terms of energy and maybe some other knock-on effects.
Yeah, so it's basically okay, we need energy, it's got to come from somewhere. If we can get it from here, we might as well get it from here. And the only way to figure out if we can get it from here is to start with these leases where people can get in the room to go figure out if it's there and if it's worth it to suck it out.
That's right. I mean, I think there was an interesting Interesting to me. It was actually not interesting. It was like a lot of US Congress right now, on fire. It was a dumpster fire. But the executives from oil and gas companies came in and were asked questions from both sides of the aisle. And one of the one of the criticisms, and I think this is like the apolitical part, until there is a suitable replacement for the United States' energy demand, and you could work that side of the equation a couple ways. You could reduce people's requirement for energy, would also like shrink the requirement for traditional sources like oil and gas, or you can go find alternative energies, solar, wind, hydroelectric, geothermal, et cetera, et cetera. Until we go shrink that, not developing US production in the form of leases and US oil production really just means, because supply and demand is very real, we're just going to import that oil from some other country. And the United States, at least right now in history, tends to, both from a regulation standpoint and the type of oil that is found, emit less than developing it somewhere else in the world.
Makes
So
sense.
it's a gray problem.
What's the make read something the other day from some lady that runs a big oil company who said that the problem with climate or whatever really is just carbon needs to be captured. And then I saw some ad from another oil company that said 90% of carbon can be captured. You're talking about alternative energy sources, and it's kind of like diet and exercise, right? If you want to be really healthy, you can diet, you can exercise, or you can do both. And then you have the best of both worlds. You can reduce energy consumption, you can increase production from all sources where it makes the most sense to produce for, but what's the deal with carbon? Is it 90% even a real thing, or is that just propaganda, man? Like, can you actually capture all the carbon that you're releasing from a tailpipe of a car? Or from an engineering standpoint, based on the limited knowledge you have, knowing that you don't work directly in the field of carbon capture technology, but just as a smart NC State Wolfpack member.
I'm smiling because I'm not an expert, and like an expert can explain anything to anybody, but I do know a little bit about it. What I will say is, like, I think that it's technically possible to generate energy using hydrocarbon and capture the carbon. Like, they opened a power plant called, I think it's Net Power, in like outside of Houston.
What
And
power? Nat power?
Net Power.
Okay,
I
go
think
ahead.
they generate like 25 megawatts. So like not anywhere near what the United States or the rest of the world needs, but like it's still like respectable. That's like 15,000 homes, I think, a year. And what they do is they take natural gas and like heat it until it's super critical. And so what you need to know about that is it's a weird chemistry breakpoint where the vapor gas like starts behaving like liquid, and then they burn it in the presence of pure oxygen. So not air like a traditional power plant, pure oxygen, and all they make is CO2, but it's pure. And then they basically like capture and either sequester that CO2 or sell that CO2. And so because that wasn't traditionally burned into like a flue gas, a dilute CO2 gas, technically like they didn't emit any CO2. And you're meeting some people's power demand. So like I guess the answer, I think, is it is becoming more and more technically possible to, on an industrial scale, sequester carbon. Is that going to make sense in a personal vehicle or home application, I currently am doubtful of that. Like, I think that's where, solar is going to make a lot more sense. But I do think that the technology it is starting to emerge in terms of that as an option for industry. The challenge is, like, now that it's feasible, the next question is, does it financially make any sense?
How do you think you go about determining that? What are the variables in that equation? Whether or not something makes sense?
I think there's a lot of, like, I think the API, which is the industry group, the hydrocarbon industry group that basically gets feedback from oil and gas and then does lobbying. They're supposed to have a view of, like, other energy industries as well. But I imagine that sometimes they're biased. Like, probably the cleanest way is to, like the global market that oil and gas is you, like, start pricing carbon. And so I think that the United States has some, like, 2000s era tax credit where, like, carbon is like $10 a ton. Investment doesn't really make sense if carbon is $10 a ton. I think it's got to be like $60 to $80 a ton. And so that's, like, it's such a weird. I just watched Don't Look Up on Netflix.
We're
this
talking
week.
about it.
It's
What did you learn from
pretty
it?
good. I mean, like, the critics apparently hated it. They're just like, man, I just didn't like being called stupid for like 2 hours. But I mean, I thought, I mean, it was pretty good. What is my
What's your takeaway?
my takeaway is, like, I think that, like, interests, like, there are a lot of interests involved in everything. Like, the takeaway there was, like, it was comedic because it was pretty, and it was satire, but it was, like, a pretty obvious, like, if we don't do X, consequences Y. It was kind of over the top. I think like, it was obviously a play on climate change. Some people argue COVID, that pandemic as well, and
Yeah.
sort of anti-science that's emerging. I think that it is totally believable that when you have lots of competing interests involved and not everybody is on the same page, the problem doesn't get solved. Like, I've worked long enough where I actually see that happen just on mundane or business problems. And so it's can be pretty frustrating to watch that, that is happening on the larger human problems as well. I do think that the challenge that we have around, like, I kind of think COVID is relatively simple, but we're messing that one up too. But the problem that we have with climate change and energy is, I think, until people stop taking energy for granted, it's hard to really listen to people who haven't taken the time to understand what all the options are.
It's kind of like all the people who were fortunate enough to have good enough parents, never really worried about their parents leaving. And so, as long as until something weird happens, it's hard to even have the conversation with them about why they might want to have a different relationship with their parents. Like, it's working fine. Like, my parents are here, no big deal.
There's that. And I mean, it's even more complex, like, from like, think about the United States and the rest of the first world and COP26. I think that largely, I mean, there are developing nations there, but largely the first world and I don't even know if that's an acceptable term nowadays, but
No,
like the
it's not. It's
developed
actually
world,
it's from cold world stuff, and it's developed and developing.
my bad, the developed world is struggling inside their own countries, and then as a community of countries to have any sort of consistent policy. And we literally have developed world problems. And so then you've got the developing world that is listening to us say like, oh, you guys are the ones that are burning dirty and your population is growing and you're the incremental emissions that are causing us to like go over the edge even faster. And those people are like, we're literally starving. You guys take the debit while we develop. And once you guys forge the way, then we'll transition to your technology. And so like it's a lot of scarcity, but the scarcity is also real when you're talking about the consequence being a diversion of resources that could end up with less people fed in the developing world.
Yeah, that's very well said. I've been reading somewhere about how there's 1.1 billion people in the world that don't have electricity. I read somewhere else that perhaps the greatest engineering miracle of the last century was the electric grid. And when you take it for granted, you just think maybe you notice a light line when it gets in the way of a pretty picture of a sunset you want to take. But for the most part, you don't really notice the light line. It's just an ever-present part. My granddad worked for the TVA putting those things up back in the 30s. So like it was a lot of work, a hell of a lot of work. I have no idea how human beings did that much work before we even really had giant tractors or bulldozers, or like they really dug those ditches or dug the holes to put the poles in. Like it was a lot of work. This is a long way of going about saying like, how is it that over a billion people still don't have electricity? And is it true for gas as well? Are there places where it's a global market, but are there places where you can't buy a tank of gas in the world today?
Yeah, probably. I mean, I think last time we were talking about like the attack on I think Colonial Pipeline. I mean,
Yeah.
that was an interruption in the developed world that started making supply much lower. I mean, that sort of stuff exists where there is geopolitical conflict, and then probably the 1.1 billion population stat comes from remote or very poor locations that aren't anywhere close to transportation routes, or the transportation routes and logistics are not economically justified. Like they're not going to pay out, so no business is taking their business there. It's like if you move to a city and opened up a business, where are you going to set up shop? Like there might be neighborhoods where you go, hey, I want to pass on that. And if everybody passes on that,
guys, I mean, that seems like a fundamental conflict. You're talking about, even though it makes perfectly good business sense, is like if I'm going to extract value over here to produce a product, and I've got to be able to extract more value from people than it costs to produce that product, so I can continue to grow my capacity to produce that product. So if there's nothing that you can get from these poor people, but isn't that kind of like the same thing? Like, isn't poor really just mean inability to access affordable energy and technology? Because most people don't feel poor if they're watching Netflix.
that's true. I mean, and like my intent is not to turn this into a spin job, but like one of the advantages of gasoline and diesel is that it's actually pretty easy to transport. Like, so when we were talking about electricity, because I think that was the stat, it was 1.1 billion people don't have electricity.
And I was just wondering that, like, there are a bunch of people that also don't have gas. And you answered the question and kind of affirmed what I was thinking already. It's just, isn't that what makes people poor? Is like energy poverty. Like, but it seems like it's instead of like monetary poverty is a reason that energy companies won't go provide energy for these people. Instead of realizing, oh, if we put the energy there, then the money comes because of all the things that these people can now do that they weren't able to do before, that we just take for granted. Like having a refrigerator for some medicine, or, not having to burn
Or
pieces of dung for food, or clean water because they have a little water purifier, or a million different tiny devices that we already have, but are worthless without access to energy. And like just getting people up above that terrible subsistence level. It's going to take energy. And I'm just wondering, it is portable oil and gas, but isn't there a giant infrastructure that has to be put down ahead of that? Like, it's easy to take the truck on the road if the road already exists, but you have to build the road first, right? And then you have to put the tank in the ground, and you have to have the machine that can dig the hole to put the tank in the ground. But once the infrastructure is in place, like in America, so we didn't get to that part last week. So we know about the different levels that the different chemicals live on, which was incredibly interesting, like what crude oil turns into. But where's it? So then what happens? Like, how's it get to our house?
Okay. Yeah. So the kind of going back to the very large vessel, the distillation column with all its cuts, we call them, the cuts being LPG, naphtha, diesel, kerosene. So essentially, like, all of those are withdrawn from the distillation tower. Often there's secondary processing to make them the products we know and love, or some of us know and love, some of us use. So once that's done, like, every product has individual specs. So take gasoline, for example. When you go to the pump, generally you're going to be looking at, when you show up, there is a primary spec for octane. So you're going to be looking at 87. Premium tends to be like 93.
Yeah.
And so there are actually a lot of other specifications behind the scene, key to which being sulfur, nitrogen content. So once that gasoline is blended up at the refinery, so it comes off the distillation units. Gasoline is kind of an interesting one because it's kind of like a mixed drink. There's several things that you blend up to make the gasoline that you drive around town with. And I think last time,
like the depth of.
So you've got
a mixed drink.
A mixed drink, delicious.
The last one you'll ever have, it'll set you on fire. Have a hot night.
Yeah, put it in your car. Your car likes to drink it. So naphtha that's sweetened, because again, like sulfur is a spec, so you don't want anything sour unprocessed, but they have sweetened naphtha. There's typically some amount of LPG that helps it evolve vapors off, so that when it's injected in your engine, it lights more quickly. You've got several components that help actually make your octane high. So we call that, there's a unit called the reformer, and it reconfigures naphtha molecules in a way that boosts octane. If your octane is too low, what happens in your engine is you get that knocking, which is essentially when your pistons in your engine expand the space under the piston, pressure goes down because that volume is expanding, and it's much easier to light things. And so if you have too low octane, you'll get several explosions as your engine is expanding the chambers. The right amount of octane makes sure that is like a controlled explosion. So back to the mixing concept, it's like we're mixing stuff to make it the right volatility. We're mixing stuff in to make it the right octane. We're mixing stuff to make sure it's all low sulfur. Once it's mixed up, we put that in a tank, and then we have the two primary, we have the same three options we have to transport crude. One option is that tank is pumped to a pipeline, and Colonial Pipeline we were talking about earlier. So that's one option. Colonial goes from like Texas across Louisiana, Mississippi, and then up through North Carolina, Virginia, I think all the way
Does it
to
stop anywhere along the way, or does it just have a one track straight to the East Coast? Like, how's that work on a pipeline? I've done all my sweetening. I got some sweet gas. I'm getting ready to sit down with some high octane. It's gonna control an explosion perfectly. But it's got to get to the car, so you put it in a pipeline, and it's just how it's going. Like you said, how fast?
13,300 gallons per minute.
Yeah, I did math last time. 50,000 barrels an hour
Is that fast? Like, I know volumetrically it's a lot, but like, is it 10 miles per hour, 20 miles per hour? Like, how fast? Because it's slick, it's lubricated. It seems like it'd be able to, but I don't know fluid dynamics or anything, so I don't know how that works.
Man, I am not. Let me see if I can remember. I think it's like 2.5 feet a second, but that's pretty fast.
Yeah. 1001. That's it. 1001. That's how fast it is. If it just keeps doing it.
I'll follow for me. I don't.
Yeah, like,
actually,
hey,
hold on,
people,
hold on.
let's teach you how to do math.
That's my problem. Well, I was getting it. It's like 2 miles per hour, which like sounds slow, except that it's constantly moving. Like the pipelines don't shut down.
It just keeps coming and coming and coming. Just
yeah.
So
anyway, I say they don't
shut
shut down. They shut down, but not for very long. So like it's just kind of a consistent flow of
right. Unless they get ransomware or whatever. But if it's going, then so anyway, there are exits or like off ramps. Like, hey, let's leave some of this in Alabama or whatever, and then it just keeps going. And that's
there's
just
off ramps. Yeah, no. So there's off ramps. And those off ramps lands you in some different tanks, typically around in local terminals. And then often from those terminals, like a truck comes and picks up gasoline, diesel, kerosene. And
so
then
like those big silver tank trucks would go to one of those places. Okay. And then what do they do?
And then they'll drive out to your like local gas stations and deliver.
No, the pipeline, John just said something interesting. The pipeline that we're talking about transports the final project or the final product. The crude coming in and then like the final product going out, right?
So there are two. The way to think about it is there's like dirty pipelines that are bringing in raw materials, and then there are clean pipelines that transport the final products. So like they essentially work the same way, but it's like you keep them separate because if you mingle them, you'd be off spec for your final product.
Ask you it about on a text one time, but tell John about it, like how you can flow diesel and gas down the same pipeline without needing like 4 different pipelines for each product.
Yeah, there's I can't remember the physics term, but essentially if you have things at the right pressure, you're able to push gas. So the way to think about it is it's almost like loading a gun. And so like you load gasoline into this pipeline and it starts flowing, and you might have sent 300,000 barrels of gasoline down this line. The problem is like the pipeline itself is 300,000 barrels inventory in this example. So to push that gasoline to get it out to its final destination, you then load diesel behind it. And at the right pressure, if you push that diesel, that gasoline will essentially just like be pushed along, and it'll come out in front. There is like a little bit of intermingling, but normally we just measure where that interface is, and we like dump it out so that everything stays on spec.
Dump it out.
Where's it go?
You dump it out. You just like put it in a small collection tank. Some people will buy that for reprocessing. Sometimes sometimes like you'll use it to do some terminals can use it as some terminals can honestly like blend it in like larger batches, and it'll just gets mixed in because like the whole thing is a mix anyway.
Yeah.
But then some
So
terminals will just like send
they
it
get
back.
down to the percentage where it's acceptable, but it still creates volume that's sellable.
That's right.
It's
a
like a
volume
drug
business.
dealer cutting the product, some cocaine with some baking soda or whatever. That's a good business. Man, there's
I'm gonna listen to
like
Big Pill.
every way to make money off this is possible. It seems like it's already been thought up. Can you think of any new ways we can make money from gas other than using it to connect with each other and create things that are actually useful?
Man, not off the top of my head. A lot of it, like we talked about last time, it's an enterprise. I mean, there are literally people that we pay to measure to make sure that like there's like third people we pay just to witness transportation of fuel, just because like gasoline right now is like $75 a barrel. So like if you have 100,000 of those, it adds up real fast. So we like pay people to just make sure that everything is flowing the right direction and what we're expecting to receive gets received.
It's a good opportunity for the blockchain and some Internet of Things devices to step in and fill that gap. Surprised that hasn't happened already. And you still trust people that could say, yes, it's on the way, when really it was on the way to Mexico. Anyway, that's crazy. Yeah. So that was just an example of one of the crazy things that grows up in a ginormous enterprise. There's even money to pay people just to check to make sure that things are going what they're supposed to, because it's a very valuable piece of cargo on even one truck. So that goes from the truck and then it dumps it off in a tank under the ground at the gas station, and the gas station, it goes to your car. So this is an honest to God question. That's a crazy process you just explained to us. It requires a lot of people to keep working. Can you imagine a future where it's not just electric cars and solar? Because that's a lot simpler.
Can I imagine that future?
Like where that doesn't happen. Like is there some inherent advantage of oil that we're missing, assuming that we get the batteries right for storage? We already know that we can do the production with far less land use. And if we can just get it where we wanted it to go in battery packs or whatever, or not even doing it centrally, but doing it locally and individually, like long term, what else? I guess there's Alaska half the year if the batteries aren't good enough to hold all the summer sunlight when it's up for 24 hours a day. But in what situations, even in a world that's mostly EVs with the fossil fuel applications, still be tanks, like jets, like what do you?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the apolitical and even like, so I mean, I'm an engineer by degree and by nature. I'm team solve the problem.
Yeah.
And so if the problem is meeting the world's energy demand, I'm like, we should first pick the very best solution. And then if that solution has its own constraints, then we should pick the next best solution. I think maybe we might be making this problem harder based on the order by which we developed technology.
Yeah, I was thinking about that the other day. Like if we could go back in history and solar panels and oil were there and they both got a 50-50 split in terms of development, like if we had a chance to go back and do it all over again, would we have ever chosen this crazy path that we're on to begin with? Like it was so valuable that it's worth so many trillions of dollars that this giant infrastructure has been out. There's people going to make sure the trucks are moving in the right direction with the stuff in it. It's obviously enormously valuable and enormously beneficial for the human race. We would not be having this conversation without oil.
No, I mean, like the revisionist history is like always fun. Like, I mean, I could go back because I mean, oil wasn't the first thing. I mean, like the first thing was like, go cut down a forest and burn wood. And then it was like, wood is not as good as coal. And then coal is not as good as oil. And then, with like electricity, oil is not as good as natural gas. And so like, I mean, I think it's kind of human nature. to just keep looking for the next best thing, which I think that's the apolitical science part. I think that I'm excited for future episodes where like solar experts, hydroelectric experts, everybody comes on, just because like I think that like solar definitely has a really big part of power generation. You can already see it's increasing, but like if you look at the U.S. Energy Information Administration's like list of all the power sources, there's like 15 on there. People still use coal to generate electricity. I don't have. What'd you say?
Or steam, which is the coal makes the water hot enough to make the steam to spin the turbine to make the electricity. Yeah,
Exactly right.
Yeah.
But yeah, and the problem to me is like if you're watching Europe this year, generally Europe has been more progressive than the United States on, hey, we want to look towards the future. We would like to go to non-hydrocarbon fuel sources. Also, Europe, like this fall, restarted a bunch of coal plants because the energy math was not correct. So I mean, like I think like that financial constraint honestly changes month to month, which makes this a little bit harder than it needs to be. But like to kind of answer your question, I mean, I think that when I think about the electrical grid as an example, like you were talking about like being poor at its core is lack of access to resources.
Energy and technology specifically, yeah.
Energy and technology. And so when I think about like the cost of oil and gas equipment, both to extract hydrocarbon, to transport hydrocarbon, like even the truck is probably the cheapest. The truck that drives from like the little offshoots to like the gas stations, that's probably like the cheapest thing, cheapest bit of infrastructure in the entire scheme. And it's still probably like $60,000 to $100,000. That's like not walking around money for people. And electricity, like the electrical grid, my experience with it, and there are better experts out there, that equipment is even more expensive. Like a transformer, like in all the things that regulate voltage, like it's actually even more expensive than, like the dumb trucks that exist and the dumb pipelines that exist in oil and gas. And so like, I guess what's interesting to me about the solar concept, and it'll be interesting in my mind to watch Africa, like where they may not have that. I have a central coal-fired power plant connected to a grid. It's kind of got to be this way because I already invested in all this infrastructure. What do they develop since they have the benefit of all the existing technology, but not the shackles of the old infrastructure?
Yeah.
I do think that like just even in our tax code, there's a lot of economic incentives to just maintain old infrastructure even past its point of usefulness. I don't know that we're exactly there yet on electrical infrastructure, even oil and gas, but like eventually we're going to find the thing that makes it obviously so that, hey, it's time to migrate to the new technology. And like to that, I'd still say, and there might be something I'm missing, like we're still burning a shit ton of coal. Like coal's like 1800 energy.
Yeah, there's a lot of bad stuff from the 1800s. I'm glad it doesn't exist anymore. And it's like why don't we just move on? It's like perhaps a lot of the division in our world comes from the fact that we're using 21st century communication tools with 18th century and actually 17th, late, I don't get all the centuries confused.
Yeah,
Late
that's true.
1800s technology, 21st century communications with 19th century technology or energy. Why can't I say this? 21st century technology and communication, the ability to connect while still having the base level struggle because we're using the way we get our energy is the same as it has been since the 1800s. And
Big ordeal.
it's a big ordeal. And the last century, we've gotten more done than any other time, any other 10,000 year spot in human history. So what I was curious about, I guess the last thing, or one of the last things, because I know you want to get off. Thank you for joining us again. It's been super fun to learn from you. I could do another 10 of these just with you. What is, I saw somebody say something the other day about the oil companies investing in renewable energy. Like that's a big push. I see even rebranding. I've noticed about 3 years ago, or most people probably didn't notice, but every oil company was really quick to start saying, we produce your energy to help you boil your eggs. It's remember what we're here for. So it would allow them a pivot from a particular fuel source to still be involved as an energy producer and distributor for the world, even if everybody did get an electric car. But what's the deal with the investments in renewable energy? Are they putting up solar to save themselves money at their headquarters? Or are they investing in giant fields of solar to sell to utilities so that they can own that and then earn? Like what is going on with, from your understanding of how oil and gas companies are investing in solar stuff, renewable stuff?
So I'm not exactly an expert on this. Like I have seen applications in plants where, like we just talked about how expensive electrical infrastructure is. Like something as simple as like I have something powered by electricity, and rather than lay down the electrical infrastructure, just install like a solar panel. So I mean, that's probably the smallest application. What I would say is like I have seen lots of differences in the oil majors. So like generally the European majors, BP and Shell, mostly because of, well, I don't want to say that, in part because of European regulation. Like it seems like their pivot is a lot more dramatic in terms of, and Total, I guess, is another one. Like I think I saw BP is like, we want to be an energy company and we want to do stuff with power distribution. So I mean, that I don't 100% know what that means, but it could be kind of like what I'm saying. Like we want our natural gas to go power plants, but it seems more extensive than that. It seems like they want to look at system losses. They might want to look at solar. They want to look at wind. I would say that in the States, it's less dramatic than that. And the conversation I hear more has to do with, and I mean, the conversation I hear more has to do with like, what is the actual problem? And if the problem is emitting carbon, can't we just collect carbon and remove it from the process, just like if we remove all the other impurities, the sulfur and the nitrogen?
If the problem's getting bitten by snakes, can't we just create some anti-venom?
Yes. Because I mean, we've kind of done it. Like we've done it with like like the Clean Air Act wasn't focused on carbon dioxide. It was focused on sulfur dioxide and
acid rain,
nitrogen oxide and all that stuff. And so largely that's been done. But I would say the pivot that I can see is a lot less. So I guess to answer your question, it'll be interesting to see what Europe does, because I think that's gonna be the stuff that might actually get people more generally excited. What I'd say is, and there have been a couple of oil and gas CEOs that have said this, and it kind of made sense to me. It's like, we are an oil and gas company I've kind of explained like the magnitude of the enterprise. I say a lot of them say they're energy companies. Let me take that back. But like the expertise is really in like hydrocarbon. And so that expertise can be redeployed. And so I think you're seeing BP lay off a big portion of its geologists and say, hey, we want a different subject matter expert. And so because they're doing that, and I'd say largely American companies that I can see are not, like I would expect different technology, like a different technology to emerge from those majors versus US majors. That isn't to say that US majors aren't doing stuff, but I think it's, from what I've seen advertised, it's more in the carbon sequestration space.
Got it. It's like, how do we clean up our mess in the US, and then the Europeans are like, how do we not make a mess to begin with? And so what you're saying is the type of technology that might come out of,
same, Lester.
they are effectively the same. One's more fun maybe while you're doing it. Who knows which that is. But if they're assuming that it's possible to do those things, then they're effectively the same. But it sounds like the technology is there, and the type of technology you would expect to come out of Europe might be something like some big battery pack, like where the European oil major may come up with the best form of storage that allows grid scale energy distribution, and they profit from the coming renewable energy wave or something. Or they might come up with anything that you wouldn't expect an American company. Wouldn't an American company just buy it then?
It's $9.59.
I know.
Oh, okay. Well, I was gonna say, hey, Justin, what do you think? I know a guy, and maybe you want to tune in for this and join us next week. But he started this company where they have and maybe you've met him. I know Lester has, but they make this 27-foot carbon fiber kite that has 4 propellers on it and an electrically conductive tether where you can send energy into it, get it up into the sky, and then let it do its kite figure 8 fly around thing and regeneratively spin those propellers and energize the tether. And it's said to do maybe like 360 kilowatt hours in a day per kite.
It's pretty solid.
You said 360 kilowatt hours?
Like 6 to 10 houses, depending on what country you're in.
No, yeah, but I mean, it's cool from it's like basically like a mobile wind turbine. It's like you just fly it in a place where there's going to be wind.
Yeah, and I dig I'm an engineer, I'm a problem solver, I'm not picking sides.
Yeah.
And so I totally, whatever it takes in whatever scenario it is, Alaska, blah, blah, blah. But yeah, would you, if I can get the founder of Windlift to come on, would you want to join us next Tuesday? Just wondering.
To ask questions as like an interviewer with us.
Yeah, man. Because one thing that's really interesting, I don't know if I should say, but it'll be funny either way, is I feel like he thinks wind is better than solar. And it's it's not about that, but it's just funny to have that opinion about it. And maybe he's changed, but
some people like moving pieces.
Yeah. So there you go.
There's a lot of pieces that need to be replaced.
Great
job.
As somebody who's had lots of moving pieces break on me, I'm not like the biggest fan of moving pieces.
This is the problem that you went through at work today. It's Ted. You got to go. You said, but so was the moving pieces at work, or were the moving pieces broken at home?
I mean, both have happened, but yeah, most recently work. No, but I mean, like at the end of the day, it's like everything is invited. And I mean, even I think what's interesting, and I think Elon Musk said it at one point, like essentially oil and gas companies largely have been, I mean, some people say they're being subsidized by their respective governments, but even if you ignore that, there's a subsidy that exists on the environment now that we understand there's a cost that exists with climate change. And so I think the slickest way to build that in, but it's going to be totally unpopular politically, is a carbon tax. It really is like oh, this is easy. I'm going to build the environmental subsidy in, and then that'll make sure that technologies that do not subsidize the environment, they're on equal footing with oil and gas.
Is it like a carbon, like are the oil companies like a carbon tax though, because they know that it's never going to be passed, so they just say it. You're right, it would work. Like, so basically, carbon tax, all that is really is it's a measure to appropriately price hydrocarbon produced energy by pricing in carbon as well. So it might make the price of gas go up $8 a gallon, and then all of a sudden, if that happens, then people switch to electric vehicles a lot faster because they realize the true cost when the environmental cost is factored in. As
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, I think the reason it won't happen, or this is the chicken and the egg. So the chicken and the egg is the reason those technologies exist. The reason that people still use coal today is because coal is cheap. It's like I don't know. I don't exactly have the unit of coals down, but generally, like when the price of natural gas spiked this year, people started turning on idle coal plants. So that tells me that it's quite cheap. That occurred because we did not price in the cost of a coal-fired plant's emissions. And so the chicken and the egg is people facing starvation or power loss are going to do the thing that is cheapest. And so a carbon tax levels the playing field, and it still lets the market work because, you know, everybody has a hard on for capitalism. It's generally a system. The challenge though is, like, I don't think anybody, like, the concern is the will is not there politically, because like the second you increase a person's cost by like 2 to 3 times, they're going to vote in the other guy, whether it's the right decision or not. And so that's like the chicken and the egg.
Makes sense. Well, thank you for being on. Come back anytime. Welcome to join us next week. And just to reiterate what we already know about you, Justin, we know that I with what John said. I loved your line about being an engineer, so you're for solving the problem. And I know that to be true about you because, you know, just needs to be stated again that the very first sponsorship the Ovanova Clean Energy Network received, or Ovanova Gives nonprofit received in order to educate people about solar energy, came from money that was provided by everybody buying gas and oil and paying Justin's salary. So thank you, and some other engineers that are in the family as well. It wasn't just you; it was you and your lovely wife. And so thank you for looking for ways and poking around, finding ways, and believing in some friends. We love you, man, and we're grateful for you. And it scares the hell out of me whenever I see things about things blowing up. And I know that you'll do all the things that it takes to be safe. You're smart and conscientious. And is there anything else we could do to be useful for you?
No, sirs. Thanks very much for the time. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you.